This story is about an actual sighting of Bigfoot by my partner in the woods to the southeast of the city of Broadview Heights, a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. It's not lengthy or intense. I have changed his name because the boys involved still live in the area. The neighborhood at the time this event occurred was surrounded by trees, farms, and woodland. There was a lake that has since been filled in and built upon. It's a stone's throw away from the Cuyahoga Valley National Park to the southeast. Cuyahoga means crooked river in the Shawnee language. Whether or not it's actually pronounced this way, we say Cuyahoga. In 1987, John was a 10-year-old boy doing things young children do at that age. Being summer, the boys in the neighborhood would ride their bikes around and into the woods surrounding their houses. On one of these occasions in the evening, they were headed for home through the woods and were about 150 yards from the pavement. John's bike suddenly got a flat tire, and everyone stopped to see what could be done about it, if anything. While standing there, John spotted a face staring at the group of boys. "Hey, look at that," he said, bringing it to the attention of his fellows. What they saw was an enormous hairy man with a human face peering at them from behind the enormous root ball of a mature tree. The Sasquatch stepped out from behind the root ball and did the characteristic swaying, assessing the situation. The boys accompanying John wasted no time getting their butts home. One of the boys sought help from a therapist afterwards to integrate the experience. John was left on his own with this creature, but he was completely unafraid. He sensed no aggression, but curiosity instead. John said that he was of immense stature. Being so young, he couldn't estimate height. He described him as having big, black eyes and being covered in brown-black hair and having a cone-shaped head. For a second, John wondered if he was going to help him with his bike. That's just the thing a 10-year-old boy would likely wonder. He returned the gaze, and when it got awkward, he addressed him after a minute, saying, "Okay, I'm going home now." And he began walking the bike back to his house. Although it was strange, he took it in stride. The next day, the boy who had struggled the most with seeing Bigfoot insisted that his father come to the site of where it happened. A couple of other fathers got together with the boys to see the place. Behind the fallen tree trunk was a smooth pit, about 6 feet deep, lined with leaves and brush. It appeared as if it was a sleeping area. John said, "There may have been traces such as hair or whatnot, but this was in 1987. No one was thinking about sending a sample to a DNA laboratory or following it up in any way." One day, when the subject of Sasquatch was far from our minds, I asked John a few questions to see exactly how close his contact experience was, considering that Bigfoot likes to visit people at home, especially children. I asked, "Do you recall ever hearing weird things at night when you lived in Broadview Heights?" To which he responded in a surprised tone, Yeah, I did, now that you mention it. I used to hear this light tapping or scratching on my bedroom windows, and that was out of the ordinary because there were no trees near the house. More than once, the entire house shook like an earthquake was taking place. We didn't question these things at all. The same group of boys, when in their teens, had another mysterious experience. One night they were skulking around the woods south of the area where they had seen that Bigfoot. A ravine runs from west to east behind the houses, lining Royal Wood Road. It's eastern and leading into the Cuyahoga Valley proper. They would take off from the backyard of one of the boys' houses and follow the ravine toward the west, exploring and smoking. While standing on a wall of cement designed to facilitate the flow of the Chippewa Creek, they saw 2 lights gliding toward them from the east through the woods. This confused them because there were no roads in the woods. The ground was uneven, and the lights were spaced too far apart to be a vehicle. They didn't bob up and down the way flashlights would. The lights approached silently. The boys wasted no time bolting for the outlet pipe 20 feet below them underneath the cement wall. They waited there for what seemed like a reasonable length of time. Nothing else happened. They hurried home as soon as they felt it was safe to do so. John said he spent the majority of his free time in those woods, and not once did he feel afraid or have anything bad happen to him. He didn't encounter any other Sasquatch after that. While I know this is a brief encounter without a lot of drama, it's a story that reiterates the fact that the Buckeye State is home to forest people. Perhaps Buckeye Bigfoot listeners will find it interesting. Hope this finds you well and content. Best regards. I have a story that happened about 7 years ago, and yet it still haunts me. I know you won't believe it's true, but I don't need you to believe it for it to really be true. When I would meet hikers or campers in my travels that said that they had seen a Bigfoot, I would be polite and listen. But in my head, I was making the crazy cuckoo sound with my finger making circles by my head. I never said anything, but I thought it. Well, you know that if I'm writing this, something happened, and it changed how I think. I had spent a few days on the Snake River with a river outfit that took me through Hell's Canyon. That gave me all the people interaction time that I could handle for my vacation. After that, I was ready for some solitary time, which is my first nature. I set out to hike the Upper Palisades Lake Trail, which was not far away. This is about a 14-mile trail one way. I was going to hike it to the lake, then spend the night and hike back. That would give me enough time to make it home the next day. The hike-in was smooth, with the kind of beauty that only Idaho can dish up. This location is near the Wyoming border in the lower third of Idaho, if you aren't familiar with it. I got set up with my tent that night, which is a skinny personal style of tent. It's light and it's easy to pop up and bust down quickly. I use a bare canister vault for my food. It's wrapped with a reflective tape and another wrap of neon orange duct tape. That way I can see it at night and also during the day. This is set up far away from my camp, usually tied to a tree. I not only keep my food in there, but all the food trash. So now we're to the hour of night when the sun has gone down. It's the second week of July, so I have very late sun time. But when the sun does go down, I go to bed. I made my camp away from the actual camp area by the lake. Like I said, I had already used up my human tolerance allowance for the week. I noticed a few campers by the lake had dogs with them. So when a dog showed up late that night, alternately whimpering, growling, and pawing at my tent, I assumed it had gotten lost from that camp area. I was mildly annoyed, but I opened the tent to check on it and to make it stop clawing up my tent. I flipped on my small flashlight. This did not look like someone's pet. It was dirty and rough-looking. There were burrs and mats all over its fur. But I didn't get to look at it for very long. Soon as my tent zipper was all the way open, the dog pushed its way in right into the tent. When it got in, it stomped all over me to turn around. Then it backed up and pressed itself up against me. It kept looking at the tent opening, whining and then growling, then whining again and looking at me. I was like, what the heck? What was it so afraid of? I figured it might be a bear or a mountain lion out there. Something had scared this dog pretty bad. I am not a hunter. I have zero taste for killing any animal, though I know I would in self-defense of myself or in defense of someone else. I carried a Colt python. It was older. It had been my dad's, but it was very reliable. That dog's eyes were big and scared. It was trembling between the growls, but it wasn't cold out. This made me very hyper-cautious. I covered the flashlight with my sleep cover, but I left it turned on. Quietly I stayed and tried to listen to what was going on outside, but annoyingly all I could hear were the dogs whining, growling, and breathing. I had set my tent up on a thick bed of pine needles between two trees. Down the slight slope toward the trail, the trees thinned out. But up the slope behind the tent, the trees grew thicker. I decided it was better to get out of my tent, see what it was, and to face it, because God knows a tent is no protection. If the situation hadn't been so tense, it might have been comical to watch. I had to fight this dog, climb over him just to get out of the tent. We almost rolled the whole tent over. I stood up and flashed my light all around once I got outside. I kept looking up into the branches, expecting to see the yellow eye shine from a mountain lion. There was nothing in the trees near me. I then heard the sound of something being banged. I listened to it, and I tried to figure out what it was I was hearing. This wasn't the sound of rocks clacking. It wasn't the sound of wood hitting wood or someone chopping wood. There was a hollow plunking sound. I just couldn't place it. I shined the light toward the sound, but whatever it was, it seemed to be just out of range of my little flashlight. The plunking sound continued, and it kept getting louder. Then it suddenly stopped. With that silence, my hackles were raised even worse than the dog in my tent. A few seconds went by, and then I heard another noise. It was as if something under great pressure finally popped. It was like a hollow gunshot. I slowly walked toward this sound. I had to know what it was. It wasn't far away from me and my tent. I could not sleep safely until I knew what this was. I saw a flash of the reflective tape, and then it disappeared behind a tree. Then I saw that it wasn't a tree. It was something large and hairy. It had its back partly turned to me, so I could see it a little from the side. I saw that it had my bear vault, and that it was shattered and open. I saw the flash of reflective tape again. The vault was being bounced up and down in a pair of large hands. The vault was upside down, and it was being emptied onto the ground. I heard the little tiny splats and plops of the freeze-dried food pouches as they hit the ground. That something had opened my bear vault, and that something looked an awful lot like a Bigfoot. Of all the things that I thought I would see, a Bigfoot wasn't even in the top 1,000. I didn't believe in them, you see, so they weren't on the table of things I thought I would see. But there was no denying it. That was a Bigfoot. I believed what I saw, yet I couldn't believe it. You know? What am I supposed to do with a Bigfoot not far from my tent in the middle of the night? I had my gun, and you can bet I was holding on to it for dear life. I figured if somehow it smelled the food, and that's what it had wanted. At that time, I didn't know some people say that a Bigfoot will kill a human. I know there's a big fight all about that on the internet, but right then, I didn't know that, and I wouldn't have cared anyway either. I know enough to trust the instincts of an animal, namely that dog. If that dog was scared, I should be at least very cautious. All of that was going through my mind at light speed while I made my way back to my camp. I thought about just leaving, but it was literally totally dark out there, maybe 1 a.m. or so. I didn't know if the Bigfoot knew I was there. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, it would eat the food and go on. The dog was still in my tent. I unzipped it and left it open if he wanted to come out. But no can do. He stayed inside the tent. I paced and I kept checking all around for over an hour. Finally, I decided it had to be gone. I hadn't seen anything and I hadn't heard anything at all again. But I also didn't want to go looking for it. I decided the best thing was to stay awake and to keep watch. I kept my gun and my flashlight out. I paced some of the time, I sat down some of the time, but I didn't get back into the tent. Not that I really could anyway. That dog refused to leave. In that time, I was having one heck of a conversation with myself about what I had seen. The minutes crept by slower than hours in the darkness. Seemed like daylight would never come. With the first pink in the sky, I felt more calm. The more light there was, the more safe I felt. And I thought, well, there had been nothing for hours, so it had to be long gone. The more I thought about that, the better I felt. As it got lighter and lighter, I could now see more and more around where I was. It was still dusky, with the sun not up over the horizon yet. And yet I saw something that shot me through with an electrical feeling that curled my stomach right up. I kept staring at what I thought was a tree stump, but it wasn't quite right. And I was sure that it hadn't been there the night before. It was maybe some 30 feet or so from me between the thinning trees that were between my camp area and the trail. When I set up camp the night before, I could see the trail clearly through the tree trunks when I stood by my tent. When I walked down to the trail and looked up, I couldn't see my tent easily. It was very well camouflaged. I looked well both ways, both times. I would have remembered a large stump in the open like that. It was by itself, and it was in a direct line of sight between the trail and my camp. And it was the only stump. I know I would have noticed it. The more I looked at it, the more sure I was it wasn't a tree stump. Old stories I'd heard somewhere suddenly came back to ring in my head. Stories of Bigfoots that made themselves look like trees or tree trunks, and of how still they could make themselves sit for very long periods of time. I thought about that when I remembered what I had seen in the middle of the night with my bear vault. The more light there was, the more details I saw that told me that was not a tree trunk. I was sure I saw dark eyes looking right back at me. It was like when I was a kid and I stared at the corner of my room all night thinking someone was there. Sheer terror when it was dark. But the closer it got to morning and the room got lighter, well, the little boy in me was able to see there was nothing there. But this was the reverse. The more light there was, the more I could see something was there. Dark holes stared at me over knees pulled close to its body. Long, furry arms were wrapped around itself. The face was mostly hidden behind its knees, leaving its head sticking up like the torn top of a tree stump. Before I saw it, I was counting down the minutes to sunrise so I could leave. I was ready to hightail it out of there. But now I was confronted with a very big obstacle. This stare-down was chilling me to my very blood. And it was a stare-down. I didn't want to look away from it. Then I heard a horse nicker and whinny, and I heard the clip-clop of hooves as they went by. My eyes left the Bigfoot just long enough to look behind him, down to the trail beyond on the slope. I saw the distant shapes of people on horseback coming into view. I looked back to the Bigfoot. I saw the slightest movement from it, like it also listened to the horses, but yet it never took its eyes off me. I thought talking to it calmly would help, so I told it that I was just passing through and I just wanted to leave. There was no reaction. I then said something else to the same effect, and I stopped when I heard a low rumble. I can't call it a growl. It was more like a chest rattle. It dipped its head more behind its knees. The dark holes were now smaller and seemed angrier. I stopped talking. Far behind him, down on the trail, I saw the last of the horse train moving out of sight. I wanted to call out to them for some help, but I saw no way that it would end well for me and maybe not for them. That chest rattle sound did the trick for the dog, though. It came out of that tent and started running up the slope like its butt was on fire. I had almost forgotten that dog was there. It had gone silent at some point. I I looked in surprise behind me at the dog and watched it run up the slope for a few seconds. I had forgotten all about it. But then I suddenly remembered I had something else I had better be keeping an eye on. I was only turned away for a couple of seconds, but when I turned around, the stump had moved. It had closed roughly half the distance between us. It was frighteningly close now, and it was now standing. It stood about 6.5 feet tall, but what it didn't have in height, it made up for with a very heavy mass, long, strong arms, and legs thicker and more muscled than I've seen on any human bodybuilder. Its posture, its demeanor, the look on its face, altogether, they radiated contempt, disdain, hate, anger, all the negative emotions. You know, the eyes will always tell you the story, whether it's a human or an animal. And those eyes were hate-filled. The dread that had been slowly spreading through my body now ran like wildfire in my veins. My heart pounded painfully. But I had a gun. I hadn't let go of that Colt all night. I made ready with it. I decided if it took one more step toward me, I would shoot. And it did. He took another step, and I fired once, center mass right to the chest. The Bigfoot jerked and went backwards, stumbling and backing up to a tree. The eyes were now large, and he was wheezing and grunting. What had once been malice in his whole demeanor now was surprise and shock. I saw blood darkening the fur on his chest. He steadied himself against the tree, looked at me, and began quickly walking away, more of a stagger, looking back at me several times as he did so. I think he figured out this was not something he wanted to tangle with anymore, and he just wanted to make a quick exit, stage left. I had not lowered the gun. I was shaking, and I remember the sound of my own breathing, which seemed very loud. But I kept the gun up as I watched him for several seconds until he was nothing more than a small figure, suddenly getting lost in all the trees in the distance. I grabbed only what I already had packed, and I left. That tent might still be there for all I know. I looked around and called for the dog for a few seconds to see if it was nearby. I didn't want to leave him there. I was going to take him out with me if I could, but I did not see him. I never knew any more about that dog, where he came from, where he went, or what his story was. I hope he found a home. I went down to the trail like the hounds of hell were after me, and as far as I was concerned, they might have been. I made the hike out of there in lightning speed time. So just think about that. That Bigfoot took a close-range hit from a .357 right to the chest, and it was still upright. He almost hit the dirt, and I think he would have if a tree hadn't been right by him. I think the heavy muscles in his chest are the only reason he didn't go down and die. I'm no expert on those kinds of wounds, but that's my best guess. I know that it would have taken a human down, and they would have stayed down. The hike out, well, it was terrifying, there's no doubt. I felt vulnerable and exposed on the trail, like I was going to be ambushed at any second. The only people I met that early were people going the opposite direction of me. The horse-trained people, well, I don't know. They must have left the Camp Lake area to be out that early. I have no idea why they'd be out there otherwise. I was not able to catch up with them or find them. I would have liked to have at least walked along with them for safety. I should have been able to catch up with them, and I have no explanation for why I didn't. Perhaps they all took off at a jog run on the horses. I only know I never saw them, even when I jogged on the trail for a while. I never even heard them. Usually you'll hear the horses way up ahead on a trail. But there was nothing. But I do know they were real. I came home, and like everyone else, I started reading and researching. My experience doesn't fit with most people's I know. Like, why did it stay at the edge of the camp, I assume, for most of the night? I saw it with the bear vault earlier in the night. Of course, it is possible I saw a second different Bigfoot, but I think that probability is pretty low that two were in that same area at that time. What did it want? Why did it wait until daybreak to start coming toward me? It could have came at me in the middle of the night, and I would never have known. Was it just waiting on the dog? Or was it just studying me? Was it curious? But the thing that keeps me up at night is whether or not I should have fired that shot. I think I had no choice, but late at night, I always have the thought that maybe it just wanted to communicate with me somehow. But then I remember its reaction to me trying to communicate with it, and I don't think so. What it wanted, your guess is as good as mine. None of it makes sense to me at all. But I do think on this almost every day, no matter how many years go by. Thank you for your time, Steve.